please welcome Stephen Markley and Dan Fogelman.
I've never done this before. I'm nervous.
I like having someone with a bio that's more impressive than mine. Not for long.
I also wrote Fred Claus. Don't get too excited. So I have a lot of questions for you. Has anyone here read the book yet? It's really big, so I can't imagine. And it just came out. You have? I'm just gonna give a little context.
Yeah, go for it.
I was not allowed to watch TV as a kid, so I've been reading like nonstop since I was a little boy. And I've known Stephen for a while, but it's truly one of the best and most striking things I've ever read in my entire life. So I hope you all get it and buy it and tell people about it, because even if I didn't know this guy, even if I didn't like this guy, it really is an incredible, incredible piece of fiction. So congratulations, first and foremost.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's massive, and the scope of it is so massive. And I asked you this right when I finished reading. Like, how did you start? Like, what was the first moment? Like, first words, first thought? How do you come up with doing something this big?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I had the idea for it. Basically the shape, right? Like, I understood the movements of it. I understood I wanted to write something about this, existential threat to the entire planet. And it had to be character-based, character-focused. And therefore, I sort of took this shape, and then I went searching for characters to inhabit that shape. And so there were a lot of like stops and starts. But the first part of the book is something, I was like looking for where each of these people were before the storm of history began. And so the first section is very much about finding these people at key moments in their lives before everything else that happens, and then figuring out where they're going after that.
Yeah. I mean, the book is, without giving anything away, which I'm conscious of, it's a sprawling, decades-long journey with all these different disparate characters who are all on a kind of collision course. And it's a page-turner, like a thriller, while it's also like contains multiple love stories. But at the heart, it's this, climate change disaster epic. That's like all these things at once. And so as you're reading it, if you're all people, I assume if you're coming to a bookstore, you're reading it going, how did this guy do this? Like, did you know it was going to be like 1,000 pages when you sat down to write it?
I mean, I knew it was going to be long. I didn't really understand how long. I think...
what year is this when you start thinking about this?
So, I mean, I was sort of concocting general ideas about it in my head as early as 2007, 2008, and then finally wrote the first chapter in 2010. And from that point, just kept moving forward in each characters' lives steadily until Ohio sort of took over. So I was graduating from the Iowa Writers Workshop. I was moving out here. I knew that was the easier book to finish, weirdly, which Ohio is also incredibly complex and multiple characters and multiple threading narratives. But set this aside, finished Ohio, and then came right back to it. And I was reminded of a conversation with my editor at Simon & Schuster. Ohio had just come out, and it had sort of a good first week. And in publishing, like, a good first week is like sell as much as you can while you can. Like, you don't know what's going to happen, right? And so we were talking on the phone, and I had sort of like pitched this book based on a few like small sections, a little bit of an outline, but there wasn't much there yet. And he was just like, I don't know, man. Like, this sounds not clearly like the next thing you should write. I'm just not sure. Yeah. And then I remember saying to him, I was like, Ohio is not the book I wanted to write. This is the book I wanted to write. Ohio was the one I knew I had to write to get to this. And that's still the way I feel, is that this is like, in a way, the most important thing I'll ever put to paper, and probably the best thing too, which is like sort of involves sort of the sadness of it, of finally like letting it out into the world. But yeah, I mean, it was 13 years in the making. You've been writing it for like 12, 13 years. Yeah. You feel it. I mean, you read the book, and if you were an older man and said, I've been working on this for 60 years, I'd be like, oh yeah, that tracks with the book. But I wondered that as I was reading it, like, do you ever have the experience as you're writing this and you're seeing what this is, where somebody is throwing themselves in front of the train tracks trying to stop you? Because it's a really difficult book. And what I've loved about your first novel and this book
and I'm curious how much, like, when I'm making like kind of dramedy TV shows or movies, I'm conscious of like, oh, is it getting too sentimental? There should be a laugh here. Is it too much death? Is there too much thing? And it's a balancing act that I've never been able to master. When I think of the book, it's going to get, conversation will start around the length of it and the climate change nature of the epic thriller kind of that it is. But I read there's so much humanity in it and there's so much love. Is that a thing you're trying to strike a balance with, or consciously, or is that just something that's where I live and that's what happens? Because there's great character journeys inside of it as well.
I just think the book doesn't succeed unless you're wrapped up in every single character. And that was, the overriding goal of writing it, is to make sure every single chapter, every single person involved is as arresting as the next. I mean, obviously there's some bigger set pieces that are hopefully very propulsive, but in terms of finding just the humanity and the core of every single person. And so there's some bad people in the book, and just making sure you're digging into them and finding out why they are like this. And then also when you encounter the heroes of the book, they've got their shit going on too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there what's the opening chapter of the book, if anybody's glimpsed at it, is about what's the opening?
Methane hydrates.
It's 3 pages on methane hydrates. And I was like, oh shit, my guy lost his mind. No one's going to read this book. And it's that complex scientifically. And a friend of mine is reading it now off my recommendation. And he texted me and he said, the science is so intense in it, but it's somehow so followable.
Yeah.
I was curious, where the research starts, and were you somebody who was a climate change activist? Did you minor in biology and science, or was it all new to you? And how did you figure this all out?
I mean, I think as early as college, I had sort of turned my attention to this hyper object that is our climate crisis, right? It is so incomprehensible and so difficult to wrap your mind around, and therefore so impersonal. It's we all kind of know it's happening. I'm sure there aren't a lot of denialists in the room right now. But even though we know it's happening, it's really hard to feel emotionally what the stakes of this moment actually are, right? So for me, it was how do I get to the core of why this matters and why it should affect all of us on that level, right? And the way to do that in that opening chapter is you just have this scientist, this dad, and mostly his preoccupation are his, 2 young girls, his wife, and his research. And so the first chapter sort of weaves those things together. And that was, it was the first story I ever turned in at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And it won a little mini award there, and that was
the story of that scientist.
Yeah, so that chapter was just this short story, and like I said, I was sort of searching for who these people were that were going to inhabit this book. And then a mentor of mine there, Ethan Kanan, sort of sat me down. We were talking about it, and he was like, "This is incredible," and I thought you had kids because it feels like this was written by a father, right? And so that was sort of my first moment of okay, this project is important and matters, and it's effective. And I think the other part of it is I had that character's final moment, which I won't spoil, but just this instance with him in my head it was one of the first things I thought about. And it was just kind of my North Star as I wrote the novel. It's I know this guy is going to end up in this position with this other person, and we're going to learn something in that moment that changes the shade of his, or sort of the way we've seen his entire life up to that moment. And I think that's how you get through a book this long, is you have your North Stars and you just write and write and write towards them, and then edit it for 11 years. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and so are you, is your science coming from conversations, from just Google searches? It's so in depth, the amount of knowledge, the amount of knowledge, both politically, socio-politically, and then primarily ecologically.
Yeah.
It's so massive that I was how did,
yeah.
My first question, we had dinner and I was have you always been special? Have people been telling you you're special your entire life? Because it's that, and we have a couple of writers from a show we worked on together back, and they make fun of how
the hacks, right?
They make fun of how much I like his writing, but this book is really I'm telling you guys, it's crazy. He's a genius, and he's just a regular guy who dates people, and I don't really understand. So are you talking with scientists every day? Are you living with scientists? How do you do
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No,
how do you do this, Stephen?
Well, look,
I've been screaming.
it's like with the opening, this idea of methane hydrates, right? Like to me, this is one of those things built into the Earth system, and it's like it's happened before where we, usually naturally, like an amount of carbon goes into the atmosphere, and these hydrates, which line the world's coasts and the ocean, start melting, and that creates this feedback loop that overheats the planet. And so the idea is just like this guy is studying this process. And as he's looking at it, he said, like, holy shit, like we stand a chance of setting this off with what we're doing. And interweaving that with his, this letter that arrives and what it sets off in his life. And to me, it was just like, okay, you have to understand as much as possible about methane hydrates in order to fake it. Like, obviously, I'm faking all of this. I don't really know anything about anything. But you just learn as much as you can, and then you cut away 70% of it,
But where are you learning it? Where are you learning it? Are you talking to people, or
they're books? I come to the bookstore, and yeah.
Did you vet it after?
I did on the way talk to scientists, many policymakers, scientists, people who worked in DC, all this kind of everybody I could badger into talking to me, including James Hansen. I mentioned this on my Seth Meyers appearance, if any of you caught that. But no, James Hansen was one of the first scientists who got in front of Congress in 1988 and said, look, this is a fucking problem, right? And so we were at Iowa, and he was coming through, and I just like kept emailing him until he responded and, said, hey, would you meet with me? We talked for an hour. We talked about methane hydrates a little. We talked about policy, and a lot of Tony, the character in that chapter, sort of resembles him. I mean, it's not like obviously a one-to-one thing, but like there's DNA of that person in Tony. As with all the characters, I feel like I was looking for real human beings to at least take shards or fragments of them to create the character. Because
also I know it sounds boring when he talks about it, but I'm telling you, like, I didn't get out of bed for 4 days reading this book. Like, my back is messed up still over Christmas break. I swear, 4 days I did not move reading it. So that's what's magical about it, is like the density of the science and the policy. It's like a thriller page turner too, in a really weird way. The policy is the other part of it.
Yeah.
You read it and sometimes you're like, did like a staffer for the congressman write this, because it's so intricate. And you chose to, I hope to tell me if it's a spoiler. Can I talk about the amount of time it spans?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
The book spans like 40 years, and it kind of, it misses the middle, which is kind of the period we're in right now. So you get to live in a history where these fictional characters are living inside of a world where Obama was president, followed by Trump, followed by Biden. And then it skips a period of time and picks up in what year?
2025.
2025. So you've missed the moment we're in right now. And now you can watch a fictional person become president, and it doesn't bump. And it's a really interesting choice. And I'm wondering if you ever debated making that middle section, whether you were going to, I wonder if you ever debated not skipping the middle section. And I wonder if you ever debated fictionalizing the middle section in the idea, meaning there is no Obama, Biden, Trump. Like, did you ever consider that, and why did you make that choice?
I mean, like what I said about understanding the shape right away, like having that shape in my head, I knew it was going to start in our recent recognizable past. It would lie to the present of its moment of publication, or whenever that would be. Originally, I think, this will be like 2014, and 10 years later. And then it would pick up in the near future. And the frustrating part of that was, as you may have heard, like this major climate bill got passed recently. So I had third, fourth pass, which is, part of the publishing process, in my hands, trying to decide if the fucking Democrats would manage to pass this bill, because it would change my book, in certain ways, right? So fucking Democrats passed it. Goddamn them. I mean, good. I was sobbing with relief and all that, but like, it sucks for my book.
Was that I read it over the Christmas holidays, and I'm finding it hard at times. I was so immersed in such a real world that I actually find myself at times going, wait, where's that person that's going to be running for office? Yeah. Like, my line's blurred for half of a second, especially as every time you turn on the news and there's something going on with a storm or the climate. I got so taken into a world that's so rare. That's a real world with real people in a real time we're living in, and that lives in the near future. That I find myself getting confused. Have you heard that from other people? Like the lines blur a little bit of like this storm's happening. Like, oh yeah, well the next thing that's going to happen is this because I read the book, as if it's factual.
Yeah,
and I think there's something in the fact that you grounded it with real people in a real world in the middle that makes the lines blur in a really confusing and kind of haunting way.
Yeah, I mean that was the aim is make sure that this book feels like it could happen, and because it can, and it's so weird. Even the few weeks leading up to the publication, it's like we had this horrifying winter storm, which basically happens around Christmas in the book. Yep. This insane atmospheric river situation in California. A bigger one of those happens in the book, and it's one of those things where this entire process, especially in editing it the last 3 years, like I've had to go back and work with my editor to revise moments that have because they happened in the real world, and it's like, oh, Russia was supposed to invade Ukraine in 2035, and now it's happened now. So yeah. It was a constant process of the reality outpacing my fictional world that I was writing.
You told me that. I think it's okay to say that Stephen King is occasionally, when something's happening in the world, he'll drop you an email going, "Are you seeing this? It's just like in the book."
Yeah. He does that now. We're solid pen pals, and I'll get an email from him with like, Arctic unfreezing pathogens, and he's like, "Well, you called it," and yeah. So
there's a character in the book to me that's one of the like great constructs of a character that I've read in literature in a while, because she's so hard to pin down. And I do any of you do this when you read? Like, I get a picture of somebody in my head when I'm reading a character. Sometimes it's a famous person, sometimes it's a friend of mine. I get like a visual image in my head. And with her, this character Kate, who I would call in some ways one of the central, if not the central protagonist.
Yeah.
She's the part the movie star is going to desperately want to play kind of character. But I kept getting different images in my head, and it kept evolving, which rarely happens for me. Like there would be a description of her and it would flip me on my axis. I'm curious where you started with that character. I know you don't want to give a lot away, but this is a climate change warrior character who's a bit of a kind of, Joan of Arc type kind of rebel and takes no shit. And she's just so wholly original.
Yeah. Thank you.
I was taken by her, and I'm curious where that character came from.
I think she was like she is the heart of the book and existed before I'd written anything. And like any good character, there's an alchemy that like you can't quite explain. And I think like part of the driving factor for me was I was trying to figure out how to tell her story, and I knew it like couldn't be from her, because she is somebody who is constantly eliding who she is and what's happened to her and where she's from. And like, you never quite know if what she's saying is true. There's that little like inkling of, wait, who actually are you? Right. And so her story is told from the point of view of this guy who has the misfortune of falling in love with her. And sort of watching him go through life, watching her star rise and her become this sort of like asteroid in politics and in society, and trying to, imagine what it's like to be in love with somebody like that, who is just so relentless and so singularly focused, and who is actually affecting something. And so I think like a lot of the power of that story comes from sort of his desperation to get her to stop this very important thing she's doing.
And that, it got me, because it's a character like when you're younger, maybe you date that person who's like this. It's like they're like it's like you're holding on by your fingertips, and they're just this kind of crazy, like wild, smarter than you and faster than you, and you're just like holding on for dear life for as long as you can to this person. And she reads like that, but she's complicated and fucked up. And it's also, I'm just monologuing about your book, but there's also like, there's these two factions, like in any revolution, of like, how do you fight climate change? And there's those who are like kind of through action and peaceful political protest. And then there's other sets of characters who think it's time for more radical stuff. Terrorists make us scared in the world of our good normal lives, why don't we turn that back on the people who are ruining the planet and environment? And those two factions are at war. It's so complicated all over the place. But I kind of wanted to watch you just read something, because it always seemed like a pretentious thing to do in a book reading. But I thought but do something of Kate, because that's the character I'm talking about, and I thought it would be cool.
So this is from a Vanity Fair article that comes out in 2026. And it's called Chaos and the Planet's Last Stand. Once an anonymous foot soldier in an underfunded climate justice group, Kate Morris and a fierce blue fire defied party politics, upended the midterm elections, and have reignited momentum on the climate crisis. Moniza Faruqi profiles the frank, funny, fearless woman who has stormed to the front of the movement, even though she may not be welcome there. So we'll just skip to the halfway through to the end. This is her. She's in Phoenix, giving sort of her presentation as she barnstorms the country ahead of the 2028 presidential election. So here's my whole presentation, says Kate. Soak it up. The logo behind her switches to 430 parts per million. I'm not telling you anything new. That is the carbon dioxide level of the atmosphere today. We started at around 280 before the Industrial Revolution. We know the absolute safe upper threshold is 350, which the world blew by in the 90s, and it's still rising at the rate of 2 to 3 parts per million every year. It's as simple as this. The fate of every man, woman, child, and species on this planet is bound to this number. Nothing matters unless we can stop and eventually reverse that number. She steps back from the podium and decides to pull her hair into a bun, swiftly snatching a hair tie from her wrist and running her hand over her face to collect loose strands as she speaks. She gives a quick lesson in the basic physics and chemistry of greenhouse gas emissions. Simple enough that when savant Arrhenius made a few back-of-the-envelope calculations in 1896, he predicted that if smokestacks continued to belch CO2, the planet would eventually warm by 3 to 6 degrees centigrade. This remains exactly in line with what the most sophisticated computer models still say today. What most scientists have been wrong about, Morris continues, is how quickly our planet's systems could unravel given this additional heat. The chaos we're seeing is from just a 1.2 degree temperature rise. Now we have feedback loops to fear. Her hands make swift, enormous gesticulations, a conductor building urgency for her symphony, as she describes the Amazon's epic droughts releasing 6 billion tons of CO2, equivalent to annual U.S. emissions. She moves on to the permafrost in the tundra of Alaska, northern Canada, and Siberia. Scientists believe by the end of this century, she skips one palm across the other to send it riding to the sky. The permafrost could release 100 billion tons of methane, which is equivalent to 270 years of emissions at our current levels. For anyone who hasn't read Anthony Pietrus's terrifying book, at that point there is no adaptation, no survival, no Earth. The entire surface of the planet will be too hot to sustain life. So we're not just talking about fucking polar bears here. We're talking about the violent disintegration of civilization, followed by a slow-rolling global genocide, and it's underway right now. In other words, it might already be too late. Here's the absolute best-case scenario of where we are. She leaves the podium and approaches the edge of the stage. She stops with her toes on the precipice and leans forward, outstretched arms quivering in tight, tiny circles for balance. She teeters forward impossibly far, and one can easily picture her sprawling, face first into the front row, cracking her chin open or worse. There's a palpable anxiety to watching her perform this feat, the crowd tensing at this gut-clenching display, the spotlight spilling her long shadow across the stage. 2,000 mouths exhale with relief when she finally catches hold of her momentum and tilts back from the edge. She smiles at herself and returns to the podium. Again, that is our best-case scenario. We have a precious handful of years left to act, and I promise you this. If you do not join this movement now, you will wake up 10, 15, 20 years from now and feel sick that you didn't do everything you could during the sliver of time when we still had the chance, when we hadn't yet fallen over the brink. I've heard this speech multiple times by now, but there is something acute about the blanket silence that engulfs this crowd. Morris checks her notebook on the lantern. So what does that mean? First of all, forget about your carbon footprint. Carbon footprint is a PR term invented by an oil company. I want you to remember 2 words. These words replace 430 behind her. They knew. They are the carbon majors, the 100 companies responsible for over 70% of emissions since the 80s. Their own scientists knew what would happen. They knew if they kept burning their reserves, they would threaten the future of the human race. They knew and they built their oil rigs to account for higher sea levels and more intense storms. They knew and they told us to focus on our consumer behavior while they locked us all into structures of hyperconsumption. They knew and they waged a propaganda war of denial and delay. They knew and they're still fucking doing it. There is no other way to put it. They are committing the greatest atrocity in human history, and they knew. They knew and they told us to worry about our fucking carbon footprints. We'll stop there. Will you hand this to that?
Yeah. She's wild too, and she's hyper confusing, hyper sexual. It's a super interesting character because it's also, it's interesting. Like, it's even interesting that you chose to read that section, because I feel like the book could get swallowed by just the conversation about climate,
Sure.
which is clearly the agenda and what the book's about.
Yeah.
But like, I'm so taken with the characters and the character stories and the storytelling. And when I read it, I was thinking today, Kate, my wife, was saying, like, what are you going to say at this book thing? And I was trying to think of what to compare it to. And it actually reminded me of, like, when I look at, like, Star Wars, and I'm like, how did that guy, like, think of all of this, like, this world? And because at the end of the day, it's about storytelling. Like, you've told a great story here. And when you read that, though, you describe the pin drop silence. You can kind of feel it here. And I'm curious, because it's a weakness of mine in my writing. Like, I want, as a human being, like, I want everybody to like me, right? It's a fault.
Yeah, I don't worry about that.
No, nobody
clearly.
likes you. Yeah. But like, I want everybody to like me, and I want everybody to like the things I make, and I want them to be nice, right? Like, this book is really, really hard. And I feel like you actually throw down the gauntlet to the reader right in that opening chapter about the
methane hydrates
and say, like, this is going to be challenging. It's going to be 900 pages, and it's going to be hard. And what happens is going to be dark in a lot of spots. Like, it's not easy. Like, you need to go smoke a cigarette, like, after you finish chapters. And I'm curious if that's something as a writer, does that tickle you the way that nice stuff tickles me? Or is it something you're conscious of monitoring as you write? Because, like, I felt the same when I read Ohio. I go, this is an exceptional writer who's writing really, really difficult stuff. Like, I was like, this is one of my favorite books I've ever read, and I don't know if I'm going to recommend it to my wife because I don't think she's going to like it.
Yeah.
And like, I rarely say that about something I love. And this book even more so. Like, I can kind of tell the friends of mine that I'm like, it's the best thing you'll ever read. You have to read it. And then I also know the people who it's a really hard read. And I'm curious if that's something that, and I think in the best, I say that as a compliment. Yeah. Is that something you monitor or are conscious or self-conscious about?
I think my outwardly goofy persona sort of belies my interest as a writer, or is it, a canard. I definitely always am looking for the most challenging elements. I mean, even for murders, it's like, I really wanted to do a silent episode, and I begged everyone.
That's a TV show, not when he commits murder.
But I think with this book, it's like, and there is a lot of like very tough stuff, but it is because the subject is very tough. And I think there's a way in which I've read climate fiction before, which is a little too effervescent for me, in terms of, it is not actually getting to the heart of what this is, which is violence, and which is sort of the horror of watching everything we love unwind. And the part I just read, I think like that's sort of one of the information heavy sections. But for me, it was about getting to those moments between Kate and Matt, between Keeper and his son and his wife, between all these characters where they are forced into the decisions that great upheaval forces people into. And so the upheaval comes hand in hand with the decision characters have to make about the people they love. And that is obviously the most wrenching thing to watch, to read about, to sort of inhabit as a viewer or reader.
Yeah, and that's what it really moved. I texted you after that, like, by the end, your brain is spinning of this book. You've read 900 pages, like, so much is happening. And I found myself in a part that your reference, and another part, like, almost like welling up with emotion in a positive, uplifting way, which I found is something that I saw Stephen King tweeted, was that the book it's really dire, but it's also strangely uplifting, because I think beyond the terrible, terrible climate change message, there's also a message that, like, the very people who have done this, but also people are not inherently bad. There's love everywhere.
Yeah.
Like these fucked up people who are doing terrible things or unwittingly doing terrible things. There's love stories, and they're not just romantic love stories. There's familial love stories. There's fathers and daughters, and there's fathers and sons, and mothers and daughters, and romantic love. And it feels like that's like, you can miss that in all of it. And I would hate for people to miss that and only talk about the climate. But I have a climate change question.
Great.
I find myself, I don't know about the rest of you, I'm not as knowledgeable about climate change, obviously, as Steve is, but I've hit a point where I want to do, we recycle, we do everything right, but I do hit a point where when I see another bad story, I almost have to gloss through it because I don't know what on earth I'm supposed to be doing at this point, and I can't read any more bad. And then, like last week, there was a story that came out that, oh, wow, the ozone layer could be replenishing itself a little bit, you know, in the next 30 years. Things are going in a positive direction. And I glom onto them. I'm like, see, good. It's all going well. It's all going well. I'll only read that one for a minute, right? I'm curious, like, where, after writing this book and all that you've learned, where do you lay on the scale of optimism, glass half full versus glass half empty?
Well, I think the frustrating thing, this is going to be a long answer. The very frustrating thing is that this would not be a problem if we had gotten started in 1988 when James Hansen testified and it first came to the world's attention. Or if in 1992, the Clinton-Gore administration tried to pass a carbon tax. If we had done anything back then, a gently rising carbon tax, we would not be in this situation today. What happened was fossil fuel companies came along and waged a propaganda war of denial and delay in order to burn their reserves. And all of like the majority of the damage of the climate crisis has happened since the 90s, which is a really like bonkers thing to think about. David Wallace Wells has this line, most of it's happened since Seinfeld came out. So the whole history of industrial civilization, but most of the damage has happened since the 90s, right? So we're still in this situation today where we have every technology we need, we know every policy we should implement, and we can turn this around. We still do have time, at least to avoid sort of the worst consequences. And fossil fuel companies are still going around the country, trying to gin up resistance to solar and wind projects anywhere they can so they can burn through their reserves. And that is fucking outrageous. It should make all of us furious. And I think for me, what this book did was put me in the mindset of like, okay, and Kate in her little section there points to it. And Kate, it's weird because like I would find myself thinking something about what was happening, and then Kate or Ash would change my mind about it as if they were in like separate people. But like this whole idea that we're going to solve this one Tesla at a time or by recycling this or that, like I'm not saying don't buy a Tesla or don't do that, but it's bullshit, right? It's like what we can do as citizens, as inhabitants of a democracy, and how we can accrue political power, especially at the local level. Los Angeles is a really good example. The city council has done some really good stuff lately, including banning gas hookups in new construction, right? So what does that do? You know, the idea that's emerged is what we have to do is crush demand for fossil fuels by electrifying everything. So driving electric cars, electric stoves, electric heat pumps, water heaters, et cetera, and denying fossil fuels an outlet to make money. Because what that will do is eventually, because all this technology is better, tip the scales. Those businesses will not be profitable. Wall Street will stop investing in them and will be able to turn the tide. Now, that should have happened in probably 2001 or something. The fact that we're over 20 years behind is really fucking scary. But it's, it is still possible. And that's, I think, the thing for me when I was talking to Robbie and the people at Energy Innovation, the thing that I hold on to is that what has to happen is we have to peak global emissions this decade. So that's 7 years, 84 months to peak global emissions and get them on a rapid decline. And the people in the United States of America, with the biggest economy that is still a democracy, we are responsible for that. Like, we have to do that. And so I think like the decade plus of writing this book, it's like, it's just my way of being the one little person lowering their shoulder. And this is what I can do. This is my skill. This is what I have. And I think like, it's more important that we all think about that. Like, what is our one little thing we can do to lower our shoulder and make a difference in any conceivable way? There's a book I'm reading right now called The Big Fix, which is about this idea about like, in Montgomery County, Maryland, this group of high school students started freaking out because they were like, why are we in these dirty diesel buses? Get us electric buses. And they ended up pulling it off. And like, that seems like a little thing, but it's like their little collective power changed that entire school district, right? So if you can multiply that action across multiple school districts, that's how we start to change this. I will stop rambling right now, but
by suffocating the companies, basically.
Yeah. I mean, like, we're denying them an outlet to make money. And that, I mean, obviously, I wish we could pass all kinds of bigger policy. I think the Republican Congress is going to make that very difficult. But at the same time, what the Inflation Reduction Act does is it distributes money all around the country to begin this work. And as that money flows in, and as all these battery facilities are being built and wind farms put up, et cetera, it's going to start changing the industries and therefore changing the politics of all these districts. And so, like, I have no question in my mind that all this technology is going to replace fossil fuels. That is absolutely guaranteed. The problem is the speed with which we have to accomplish this. Like, once we get past the 2020s into the 2030s, if global emissions have not peaked, that starts getting way scary. And I think it's so hard. You go to the grocery and there's all the food's there, and like, we're driving around, everything's fine, mostly fine, minus atmospheric rivers. But when you start looking at the consequences of moving past 1.5 degrees, it's really fucking frightening. And just one example is sea level rise. It sort of sounds like this tame, innocuous thing, but that is the major crisis at the end of the book, is what happens if every piece of property on the coast of the United States is suddenly not worth anything. Like, the dominoes that start to fall, and they already kind of are starting to fall if you pay attention, that gets really scary.
Because there's the potential for insurance collapses, complete socioeconomic collapse. Like, it's very interesting. Should I not have another kid? As I guess my big question. Should I?
Your kid seems great. Have as many as you want. Yeah.
I don't know. The book is like birth control. All right. They want to do questions. Does anybody have questions? Forgive my lack of. Yes. Yes, please.
I have a question about your process.
Yeah.
So a long run to get this singular idea.
Yeah, so I've had 2 major books for Simon & Schuster, and both my editors have quit immediately after working with me. So I don't know what that says. I'll let them speak for themselves. Yeah, so I had to change editors, which was, the person who worked on The Deluge was named Stuart Roberts, and great editor. And his big thing was I turned in 1,300 pages to him, nearly 450,000 words. And he was like, we have to make this shorter. And so a lot of the process was just cutting, which was very painful and very difficult. I don't know how much cutting you've had to do before, but at that length, it was like whole scenes are leaving, characters are leaving. But at the same time, he was absolutely right in his direction, which is that, like, when you want to do something this dense, this big, it's got to move. Like, it's going to be successful if the reader is actually like, holy shit, I can't put this down. And so his aim was absolutely correct. And it was just a miserable couple of years trying to do that, feeling like you're cutting off fingers every time you cut something.
Did they give you a page target?
No, I mean, they were like, this is going to be under 1,000 or we'll kill you. Like, we made the paper thinner. We crammed it. It was a lot of like freshman year sort of bullshit to get it to conform. I'm sorry, I forgot the other part of your question.
Your personal changes over time.
I mean, I don't feel like I've changed that much, unfortunately. I think it's a pretty static, which is not great. But look, I mean, obviously I'm passionate about the subject, and I think, there came a point in writing this book, like I describe it as the first 60% of writing it really scared me and made me despair a lot. Like a lot of nights staring at the ceiling until 4 a.m. being like, oh, this is actually as scary as it, one imagines. And then sort of at some point, talking in my own head about like this, like the point of this is to reorient someone emotionally about the crisis. So like you have to be reoriented. And that was what helped me with that, was beginning to talk to the people, and I think with like climate or anything environmental, with any social justice movement, there's a lot of moralizing. There's a lot of people screaming at each other. And sometimes that can be very difficult to like embrace, right? Like it's fraught. It's a controversy. Everything's tough. So when I just started talking to people who are like, here's what we do. And then it becomes clearer. Then you see the steps, A, B, C, D, E, And in seeing those, you see what levers in our economy and our politics we need to start pulling. Right. And so I think watching the Inflation Reduction Act pass after all the work of all these environmental groups, social justice groups, et cetera, watching that pass was like, okay, like we can do this. We have this bill that suddenly makes it this much easier. And so I just think like orienting myself around like there are solutions and we can make them happen and we all have power is like a very important thing I'm at least telling myself. So, yeah.
Yes.
Hi. Thanks. I'm excited to read this book now. I don't know the setting of it, so how did you just?
Yeah, and that's a good question. So, Ohio was a very specific. My first novel was a very specific, singular place, and like creating a sense of place is like vital. I think it should be another character, and so the setting of this is like the U.S. Yeah, we've all heard of it, right? And so for me, it was like finding all these places across the country and amalgamating a sense of like, what makes this weird place interesting, right? So there's Washington, of course, there's New York, some LA, but, finding those, Wyoming, like those little places I've been where, you find a sort of a sense of mystery, right? And there's a lot of Ohio in there too. And that's obviously something that's close to my heart. Yeah.
Follow up to that question. I'm also from Ohio, actually.
Excellent.
I devoured that.
No, I don't know. It's like trying to decide where your impulses to write about anything come from. It's like it's just Ohio was a story that was kicking around in my head for 10 plus years, the Deluge 20 plus years, I think like describing what is happening to our society is important, and I like trying to do it. And I make no claims if I'm successful at it or not. It's just like I can't write anything without thinking about the larger implications of the universe that surrounds the characters. And so in Ohio is like way more sort of based on experience and sort of what I saw growing up. But with this, it's bigger. Obviously, it's about like our fate as a society and even as a civilization. And thinking about that again, only through character, only through the individual experience of human beings, seeing their sadness, their despair, their hope, and their love for each other. And I think like, finding that sort of sappy center of everything is not, it's not betraying anything. It's the brave movement, right? To look into something so dark and see like, why does this matter? Why does this matter to these people? Especially a character like Keeper, if and when you read the book, it's like, this is a person who doesn't make sense why he shows up in this story until the end. And I think finding like the core of him was like a vital project as I wrote. Yeah. Hey.
First question, I was just going to say, just wondering if you could say what.
That's a good question, Phil. No, I remember because after college, I got out of, nobody knew what the fuck they were doing then. It was the recession, and I was just looking for any job. But I remember like interviewing at a couple of sort of public interest type things, and just deciding super quickly this is not for me. You're still like sort of in this mode of having to work with a lot of people. And as we know from my experience on Only Murders, I'm not good at that. It was more like I just wanted to be in charge of a world, right? And also, I just think like I didn't have the passion for it. I didn't have the passion for that route. I definitely have the passion for writing. It comes easy to me. I love doing it. It's something I would do if no one paid me for it. And yeah, and I think like all that energy, all that political energy obviously went into my, sort of deconstructing the world around me in order to write a story about it. And I think it's been a much more fruitful use of my time. I think going into politics would have made me miserable. Another fun story, Phil and I were friends for many, many years until we found out we were third cousins.
Yeah.
Which doesn't reflect on where we were born and raised.
Yeah, no, that's, we also had to stop dating at that point too. So yeah, they're going to grow up quickly tonight. It's going to be
questions. Yes. One last question. Anybody have a question? Yes.
Yeah. I think it is, I knew it was going to happen too. It's like once you've been working on something like this for this long and then you let it go, it's not yours anymore. And people are free to interpret it however they want to and say, this is what this means. And that's it's a weirdly frustrating thing. I think everybody who's ever put something into the world and it's not like, and then it's like, that's not what I meant. And it drives you crazy, right? But you can't go around tapping everybody on the shoulder about it and explaining. So I think there's a level of sadness to letting it go and letting it be read. But it's got to be finished at some point. As far as the next thing, like I've already, I don't stop working. Like I just started the new thing right away. And I will just keep working on that. I think I learned a long time ago that if you allow yourself sort of that postpartum period, then it'll sort of take over your creative life. And just like moving on to the next thing as fast as possible for me was just a way of sort of exercising the last book. And it doesn't matter if I abandon that project. But I did sign a 2-book deal with Simon & Schuster. So, they're stuck with me. Thank you. Yeah.
That's also how Steve dates, if anybody's interested. All right. Is it time?
I think that's it. I'm going to sign books. Thank you, Dan.
Guys, it's really extraordinary. Buy a copy. Tell your friends. It's so good. It really is, Steve.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I appreciate it.